You know, every once in a while somebody in the national media says something so bold about the Dallas Cowboys that it forces you to stop, rewind, and make sure you actually heard it right. And that's exactly what happened here. An NFL insider went on the air and said the quiet part out loud, the part nobody thought would ever make it into a mainstream conversation, that the Dallas Cowboys might actually be a better football team without Micah Parsons. Now, I want you to sit with that for a second, because even as I say it, it feels strange. This is Micah Parsons we're talking about, one of the most explosive players this franchise has ever had. A guy who reshaped the way opposing offenses game planned every single week. But here we are, and that statement is being said publicly on major platforms, and the wild part is, there's actually some reasoning behind it that deserves a real conversation. That's why I wanted to bring you in for this breakdown today, because I want you to think through this with me the same way you would if we were sitting on the couch just talking football. No hot takes, no shock value. Just football, roster building, and the reality of where this team stands right now. And before we dive deeper, let me ask you something directly, because it's going to set the tone for everything that follows. Do you think the Cowboys are better without Micah Parsons? Just a gut reaction, yes or no? Drop it in the comments, because I honestly want to see where the fan base stands before I lay out the full picture. And while you're at it, if you want more breakdowns like this, hit that subscribe button and help push this channel toward our 17,000 subscriber goal. Every supporter truly makes a difference. Now, here's what makes this conversation so interesting. It's not just one person's opinion thrown into the wind. This entire idea is coming from real changes happening inside the building. The Cowboys, whether intentionally or out of necessity, have shifted the way they build their defense. They've shifted the way they allocate money. They've shifted the way they use picks. And for the first time in a long time, you're seeing a Cowboys team that's prioritizing the interior of the defense, the trenches, the spine of the team, instead of relying on one superstar off the edge to compensate for weaknesses everywhere else. And that shift didn't happen quietly. It didn't happen subtly. It happened through major moves, including the decision to trade Micah Parsons for 2 first-round picks and a starting-caliber defensive tackle. That's not a tweak. That's a directional change for the entire franchise. And that leads us to the question that's been floating above this team for months now. Is it possible that the Cowboys didn't just survive that trade, but might actually end up benefiting from it? Not just on the field, but in the locker room, in the front office, and in the long-term identity of this team? That's the conversation we're about to unpack. Because whether you agree with it or not, whether it makes you uncomfortable or not, this idea didn't come out of thin air. It came from watching how this roster has responded, how this defense has evolved, and how the team has played since the move was made. So let's dig into what actually changed and why some people believe it has the potential to reshape the future of this franchise in ways nobody expected. When you look at how this entire situation unfolded, it becomes clear that the Cowboys didn't just stumble into a new identity, they were forced into it. And strangely enough, that pressure might have been exactly what they needed. The moment Micah Parsons was moved, the Cowboys had no choice but to rethink who they were defensively. For years, this team relied on being explosive off the edge, creating chaos, creating turnovers, and living off the speed of their playmakers. But as exciting as that style was, it came with a cost. It left them vulnerable where it matters most when the lights get brightest, right up the middle. You saw it in playoff losses where teams just lined up, ran straight at the heart of the defense, and the Cowboys simply couldn't anchor in big moments. And this is where things get interesting. Because instead of trying to replace Micah's production with another flashy edge rusher, Jerry Jones and this front office went the opposite direction. They rebuilt the spine of the defense. They went and got Kenny Clark in the trade. They drafted heavy in the trenches. And when the trade deadline arrived, they doubled down again, bringing in Quinnen Williams and Logan Wilson. Suddenly, the Cowboys went from being a team that got bullied on the interior to one that could actually push back. You don't need to be an expert to see the difference. Just watch how the defense has played since those moves. They're not dominant, but they're no longer collapsing. And sometimes, especially with the offense the Cowboys have, all you need is a defense that doesn't lose the game for you. But this shift didn't just happen on the field. It happened in the locker room too. Because once Micah was gone, something else changed. And this part doesn't get talked about enough. For the first time in years, the head coach wasn't sharing the room with a superstar whose influence sometimes overshadowed the staff. Brian Schottenheimer stepped in, and instead of walking into a locker room where one player played by different rules, he walked into a room where every guy was starting from the same line. No special treatment, no one above accountability. And whether fans like hearing it or not, that matters. You can't build a healthy culture when one player, even unintentionally, shifts the balance of authority. And you saw what happened when Micah's podcast became a storyline. It didn't matter whether the content was harmless or not. Once it became a distraction, once it created conversations that had nothing to do with winning football games, it caused friction. Coaches noticed it. Teammates noticed it. And you can't implement a new culture when one star is allowed to operate outside the guardrails everyone else has to follow. That's not an opinion. That's how locker rooms actually work. So when you stack all this together, the shift in philosophy, the improved defensive spine, the renewed authority of the coaching staff, you can see why people are starting to at least entertain the idea that moving on from Micah Parsons did more than just reshape the defense. It reshaped the entire structure of the team, and that leads to the real discussion here. Not whether the defense is more talented without him, but whether the team as a whole is healthier, more balanced, and more sustainable because of the move. Before we roll deeper into how this roster has evolved and why the Cowboys might be in a better long-term position than people expected, I want to ask you this. Do you feel like the Cowboys finally look like a team that knows who it wants to be? Drop a quick yes or no in the comments because I'm curious where you stand on this shift in identity. And if you're watching and haven't subscribed yet, hitting that button right now helps push us toward that 17,000 subscriber mark, which keeps videos like this coming. As the season unfolded, the question that kept coming up over and over again was simple. Did the Cowboys actually improve their defense? Or did they just change what the defense is supposed to be? And the truth is somewhere in the middle. Because when you look at the first stretch of games after the Micah trade, this defense was bad. Not below average, legitimately one of the worst groups in football. They couldn't get stops, they couldn't get off the field, and they weren't generating the explosive plays fans were used to seeing. At one point, they were sitting near the very bottom of the league in almost every major defensive category. And that's the part nobody sugarcoats. But what changed? And what really matters here is what happened once the reinforcements arrived. Quinnen Williams didn't just walk into the building. He walked in and immediately became the tone setter this defense had been missing. Logan Wilson gave them stability at linebacker, something they desperately lacked. DeMarvion Overshown returned from injury and looked like the guy fans were excited about before he ever played a regular season snap. And suddenly the Cowboys went from a defense that was getting pushed around to a unit that made teams actually work for yards. No, they didn't turn into a top-tier defense overnight. But they became something just as valuable when you have an offense that can score. They became stable. For years, this team lived on extremes. Huge highs and crushing lows. One game, they'd look like world beaters. The next, they'd give up 40 points to a team they should have handled. Now, they're not riding that roller coaster as much. They're playing more disciplined. Football. They're winning at the line of scrimmage more consistently. And they're finally giving the offense opportunities instead of forcing them into weekly shootouts. With Quinnen Williams clogging the interior, with Kenny Clark anchoring next to him, with Overshown flying around, and with Malik Hooker returning to the secondary, it feels like the defense is playing with structure instead of chaos. There's also the matter of the rookies. Donovan Ezaraku has flashed in ways that are impressive, for a second-round pick still finding his footing. Savion Revel Jr. hasn't played enough for a full evaluation, but even his limited snaps show why the Cowboys liked him. These aren't guys who will dominate headlines today, but they're part of the long-term equation, the kind of draft picks that make having 2 first-rounders in 2026 even more valuable. The front office is clearly building something, and for the first time in a while, it actually looks cohesive. And of course, all of this leads to the big debate everyone is having. Is the defense actually better without Micah Parsons? On a pure talent level, the answer is no. You don't lose a player as gifted and as disruptive as Micah and magically get better overnight. That's not how football works. But when you expand the lens and look at the overall health of the team, when you consider depth, accountability, flexibility, cap space, and culture, now the conversation gets a lot more interesting. Maybe the Cowboys didn't become a better defense by subtracting Micah. Maybe they became a better team. Before we move forward, I want to ask you something directly. Do you think this defensive turnaround is real or just a temporary boost from mid-season moves? Drop your take in the comments. And if you haven't hit subscribe yet, now's a great moment to do it. Every new subscriber pushes us closer to that 17,000 goal the channel's working toward. The other layer to all of this, the part fans weren't really thinking about when the trade happened, is culture. And you can argue all day about X's and O's, but culture is what determines whether a team stays together when things get tough. And this is exactly where the Micah Parsons conversation gets uncomfortable, because it forces people to separate talent from impact. Nobody questions Micah's talent. That was never the issue. The real question was always whether he fit what the new coaching staff was trying to build inside that locker room. When Brian Schottenheimer took over as head coach, he needed something every new coach needs: control. Not ego-driven control, not dictatorship, just the basic authority to set standards and expect the entire roster to follow them. But that becomes almost impossible when one player, the biggest star in the building, isn't operating by the same set of expectations as everyone else. And that's where the podcast situation became bigger than people on the outside realized. It wasn't the podcast itself. It wasn't the interviews. It wasn't the content. It was the ripple effect. When your star player goes on a national show, lists his top 10 quarterbacks, and doesn't mention his own guy, even if you try to brush it off, even if you tell the media it's not a big deal, everyone in that locker room sees it. They hear it. They talk about it. And then they watch how the organization responds. And if nothing changes, if the standard suddenly becomes flexible because a star feels untouchable, that's when culture breaks. That's when coaches lose the room. That's when accountability becomes optional instead of required. And for a new head coach trying to build identity, that's a nightmare. Imagine trying to preach discipline, unity, and consistency while your biggest star is operating under his own set of rules. Players aren't dumb. They see favoritism immediately. And once they stop believing the message, the coaching staff loses leverage. So when Schottenheimer stepped in, one of the first things he had to deal with was the imbalance Micah unintentionally created. Micah wasn't a bad teammate. He wasn't toxic, but he was treated differently. And whether fans want to admit it or not, that difference mattered. This is why the locker room dynamic shifted so drastically after the trade. Suddenly, everyone was on equal ground. Suddenly, the rules fit everybody. Suddenly, the coach's voice became the loudest one in the building instead of a star player's brand overshadowing everything else. And the players responded. You can see it on film. You can feel it in the energy on the sideline. You can hear it in interviews when veterans talk about buying in and doing the little things. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens when the room believes in the message, because the messenger finally has full credibility. And from a roster-building standpoint, the Cowboys gained something just as important: flexibility. 2 first-round picks in 2026. Cap room that would have been locked into a massive edge rusher contract. The ability to stack this defense from the inside out exactly the way the recent Super Bowl teams have done it. Look around the league. The Chiefs didn't win because they had a dominating edge rusher. They won because Chris Jones controlled the interior. The Eagles went to the Super Bowl with their best defensive player being a defensive tackle. The trend is obvious. Dominance in the trenches beats highlight reel pass rushers more often than people want to admit. That's why Jerry Jones made the gamble. He wasn't just thinking about this season. He was thinking about 2, 3, 4 seasons down the road. And with Quinnen Williams, Kenny Clark, Osa Odigizua, Overshown, Logan Wilson, and a wave of young players, the Cowboys can now build a complete defense instead of a top-heavy one. The type of defense that wins late in the season. The type of defense that keeps you in games when the offense stumbles. The type of defense that makes playoff football a different story. Before we move into the final chapter, let me throw a question your way. Do you think the cultural side of this trade mattered more than the football side? I'd love to see your take in the comments. And if you're enjoying the breakdown, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel get closer to 17,000 supporters and keeps these deep dive videos coming. So where does all of this leave us? What's the verdict? And what should you actually expect from this Cowboys team moving forward? The simplest way to say it is this. On paper, you didn't trade for a better defensive player when you moved Micah Parsons. You traded for structure, flexibility, and the ability to build a defense that can win late in games. That matters more than a highlight reel edge rusher when you're trying to turn a good regular season team into a legit playoff threat. The Cowboys gained draft capital, cap room, and interior defenders who help you stop the run and control the clock, and those are the ingredients teams have used to win titles in recent years. Now, does that guarantee anything? Of course not. Football is messy. Injuries happen. The third down pass rush question still hangs over this roster. Without an every down elite edge threat, can this team consistently get off the field on third down against top offenses? That's the single biggest on-field concern that could keep the Cowboys from making the leap. But when you balance that risk against what the front office now has 2 first-round picks, younger depth, players like Quinnen Williams and Logan Wilson who buy you consistency, and the ability to distribute money where it matters, the long-term outlook is better than most people predicted at the moment of the trade. And let's not forget the locker room part of the equation, because that's where seasons are won and lost more than you might think. A coach who can enforce standards without exception has leverage to install accountability, which improves practice habits, focus, and buy-in. That collective commitment shows up on game day in the fourth quarter, not in the highlights. If the Cowboys keep building in the trenches, keep getting consistent play from the interior, and if the offense remains productive, this team is positioned to be a real threat in the postseason. That doesn't mean a Super Bowl is guaranteed, but it means you're no longer dependent on one player's freakish production to carry your playoff hopes. So here's my final take, for you to chew on. The defense on the field might not be objectively better if you look strictly at playmaking and individual talent, but the organization as a whole, the roster, the cap, the draft flexibility, and the culture, is in a healthier position. That's what Colin Cowherd was trying to get at when he said the quiet part out loud. It's an uncomfortable truth for a lot of fans, because Micah was beloved and obvious to watch, but sometimes the less flashy approach wins more football games in the long run. Before I sign off, I want your final verdict. Do you think this trade improved the Cowboys' overall roster, culture, and future outlook, or do you think it was a mistake we'll regret? Drop your verdict in the comments. Also, vote in the quick poll. Will the Cowboys make the playoffs this year? Yes, no. If you like this breakdown, smash that like button and subscribe to help push this channel to 17,000 subscribers. It really helps us keep producing these deep dives.